Hello and welcome to this video. I've just received the news of the sad death of Michael Henderson, the bass player who died yesterday, the 19th of July, at the age of 71. Michael Henderson was known as an R&B and soul artist, signed to Buddha Records under Norman Connors, and he had a few hit records, but for viewers of this channel he is also known as being one of the pioneering bass players of jazz fusion. Michael Henderson was born in 1951. He moved to Detroit in the mid-60s and started to do all sorts of various session work, eventually landing the gig with Stevie Wonder. Pretty much as soon as he was signed up with Stevie Wonder, he managed to bump into Miles Davis, and Miles Davis basically stole Michael Henderson off Stevie Wonder and integrate him into his band. At that point, this is right at the point where Miles is exploring and really developing and laying the groundwork for jazz fusion. Miles had moved towards a fusion of rock, soul and jazz in the late 60s, beginning on the albums Miles in the Sky, Feed Kilimanjaro, In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew. On those albums he had started off with the bass player David Holland, who was a double bass player, jazz player, and he was more and more asking Dave Holland to play electric bass. Now David Holland does play electric bass, but he's primarily a double bass player. Obviously at this point in time Miles was looking for something else. Now it's quite a clever move, this is. If you want to integrate jazz with rock or jazz with R&B soul, what aspects do you bring in from that genre? You obviously need electric keyboards, you need electric guitar. In the electric guitar chair, Miles discovered John McLaughlin, who was equally at home playing jazz at a high level, but also had grown up listening to rhythm and blues and played a lot of rhythm and blues and rock music in London in the early 60s. But I don't think at that time the bass players, especially electric bass players, are around that could bring in that soul R&B sound. And so Miles decided to go to a non-jazz trained musician, and this is precisely what Michael Henderson was, but he was a very, very able bass player. He was first used on the album Jack Johnson, which is a really legendary album in the history of jazz fusion. This is where the groundwork of jazz fusion is really laid, and a lot of that is based around Michael Henderson's incredible bass playing on that album. He then went on to stay with Miles for about 7 years, all the way through the early 70s electric period, playing on the albums Live Evil, Agata, Big Fun, Get Up With It, Pangea, all the classic albums. And many of those albums are based around a bass riff coming from Michael Henderson. What Michael Henderson brought into the band was that soul R&B approach, and if he had the gig with Stevie Wonder, obviously he was a pretty able bass player, and Stevie Wonder's music is very influenced by jazz, albeit later on in the 70s. So Michael would have been have to have been a nifty player to negotiate some of the stuff with Stevie Wonder. He had a deftness on bass, he had a funkiness on bass. He was able to come up with some fantastic bass lines and bass riffs. His genius really can be seen on Jack Johnson. When Miles made Jack Johnson, famously, he brought the musicians into the room, which were basically Billy Cobham on drums, John McLaughlin on guitar, Michael Henderson on bass. So he's really got a rock band. This is really different to what he'd done with Bitches Brew, where he had a huge group, which was basically two groups. I think at some points 3 drummers, percussionist, 2 bass players, 2 horns, bass clarinet and a soprano saxophone, guitar, and 3 keyboards. So you got this great big monumental band. On Jack Johnson he goes the other way, and he's basically got a rock power trio with him sat on top. And when they arrived at the studios, he gave them instructions not to play. I think this was to put a pressure cooker on the band. Eventually, against Miles's wishes, they start jamming, and they start jamming on a sort of shuffly, fast blues. And this is based not around your standard blues chord structure, but a much more stranger chord coming from John McLaughlin. So they start to jam on that. Miles recognises, he's in the control room at this point, he recognises something's going on, and so he orders them to hit record. And this is why when you put Jack Johnson on, it seems to lurch into action. He picks up his trumpet, he runs in, and he gives instructions to the band to change key. John McLaughlin picks up on this, but Michael Henderson doesn't. He doesn't recognise that the key's changed. So John McLaughlin changes key, and we end up with this sort of polytonal shuffle. All right, this is really, really important. This is something that would never happen in straight rock or soul. Miles Davis, recognising that this has happened, begins to play, and his genius at actually being able to weave between two keys and make that make sense is really incredible. Michael Henderson, like the good solid soul bass player that he is, he just keeps nailing it out, right, until he recognises the new key, and then he moves to the new key. That tension, that polytonality really lays the groundwork of what fusion is, because what you have there is a groove, beats, bass line, all coming out of rock music, soul music, R&B, mixed with a harmonic sophistication that you would associate with jazz, but not only straight jazz, but more the jazz movements that were going on in the 60s at that time, coming out of free jazz. If you check out Michael's playing on the Miles Davis albums, it's quite incredible. I really feel that there's a solidity to his playing. There's a groove of funkiness and some really beautiful, well-structured bass lines there. This really should have given him a legendary status, I think, within jazz fusion. And I think the reason why that didn't happen, because on leaving Miles's band, which happened pretty much, I think, because Miles decided to go into retirement in 1975, Michael Henderson then got signed up by Norman Connors, signed up to Buddha Records, and started to make pop R&B hits with him singing on. These were very, very successful and took him down another route. In fact, it's very close to Toomey, which was the percussionist on many of those albums, who's also recently died. That after leaving Miles, he went down a sort of pop soul route. So his credentials as a jazz fusion bass player were not built upon in the same way as your John McLaughlin's and Herbie Hancock's and Wayne Shorter's in fusion bands in the 70s. His success lies elsewhere. But he has played on a number of very, very important albums. His playing on Live Evil is absolutely incredible. That's probably the most aggressive out there playing from the Miles Davis group. He also contributed to the late period Miles Davis albums Pangea and Agata, which again are so sort of psychedelic, acid-fueled, guitar freak-out jams. Absolutely incredible. And without Michael's bass playing, I think it would be a mess. So Miles's decision to bring in a soul R&B bass player, I think was very wise, and I think Michael's ability to not just be a soul R&B bass player, but able to negotiate his way through the new forms that Miles was creating at the time needs to be commended. There is a story Keith Jarrett tells of when he was in the band in the early 70s, where for some unknown reason on one gig Miles suddenly calls out Stella by Starlight, which is a jazz standard that he would have played in the 40s and 50s. And as Keith Jarrett said, the band was simply not set up to play this. Keith Jarrett, of course, would have known the jazz standard Stella by Starlight absolutely inside out, but a player like Michael Henderson wouldn't. And he said it was weird to be on stage trying to navigate through the complex changes of Stella by Starlight whilst Michael was trying to find his way through. Why would Miles do something like this? Well, I think the genius of Miles, especially at this point, was to put musicians in a situation where they were confused and for them to find their way through, and this creates new forms of music. I think those albums that were made in the early 70s didn't just provide the bedrock of jazz fusion, but it was almost like an alternative to what the jazz fusion musicians were doing. And I don't think you really started to hear the influence of those albums until hip-hop kicked in the 1980s, and then we had dance music and the electronic music and EDM. I can hear the influence in groups like Cinematic Orchestra, in Ronnie Size. I can hear the influence in For Hero, a whole bunch of bands that came up in the 90s, and that sound and influence is there today. It really influenced Bill Laswell and a lot of the Bill Laswell production methods, which you can then hear on tracks like Rocket. You can hear it on Public Image Limited. You know, even Motorhead has been touched by Bill Laswell's production, which is fundamentally coming out in a way out of these recordings. So I cannot emphasize the importance of this. Now, a lesser musician put under that sort of constraints and artistic challenges by a genius like Miles Davis would have crumbled, and Michael Henderson didn't. And also, at the same time, to have been able to lead a successful R&B soul career and have hit records. This was an incredibly talented man. He died yesterday at the age of 71. He retired in 1986, so I think he has sort of got a little bit forgotten in the grand scheme of things. I recently did top 10 fusion bass players, and he didn't make the list. And then hearing him die, I thought, well, God, this is the guy that played the bass on Jack Johnson. And we forget that. So I am, you know, I'm very happy, is that the right word, and respectful to be able to pay this little tribute to Michael Henderson. I know a lot of the viewers of this channel will know exactly who he is and know what his contribution was. So I would like to say thank you, Michael Henderson, for all the incredible bass lines on those incredible albums. We're still listening to them today, and through that music your memory will live on. Thank you for watching this video, and I will see you on the next video. Thank you very much.